The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as Queen Elizabeth sat alone in her private sitting room. The April air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of blooming daffodils from the castle gardens that Philip had so lovingly tended. She held a porcelain teacup in her hands, though the tea had grown cold hours ago. Her fingers traced the delicate rim as she stared out the window toward the chapel where her husband of 73 years had been laid to rest just days before. The Queen had always been known for her composure, her ability to carry the weight of the crown with grace and dignity. But, in the privacy of her chambers, away from the cameras and the protocol, she was simply Elizabeth, a woman who had lost the love of her life. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the gentle ticking of the antique clock that Philip had given her on their first wedding anniversary. She remembered that day so clearly. They were young then, full of hope and dreams for the future. Philip had been so handsome in his naval uniform, his eyes sparkling with mischief as he whispered jokes during the ceremony to make her smile. He had always been her anchor, the one person who could make her laugh even during the most difficult times of her reign. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside her door brought Elizabeth back to the present. She quickly composed herself, straightening her shoulders and setting the teacup aside. There was a gentle knock, and she recognized the familiar pattern, 3 soft taps followed by 2. It was Charles, her eldest son, the one who would one day carry the burden of the crown himself. "Come in," she called softly. Charles entered the room, his face etched with concern and his own grief. He had aged considerably in recent years, the weight of his future responsibilities and the loss of his father taking their toll. His eyes were red-rimmed, evidence that he too had been struggling with the magnitude of their loss. "Mother," he said gently, approaching her chair. "You missed breakfast again. The staff is worried about you." Elizabeth turned to look at her son, seeing so much of Philip in his features. Charles had inherited his father's strong jawline and expressive eyes, though they now held a sadness that seemed to mirror her own. "I'm not particularly hungry," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The thought of food. Charles pulled up a chair beside her, something he rarely did with such informality. The usual protocols seemed unimportant now, in this moment of shared grief. He reached out and gently took her hand in his, surprised by how fragile it felt. "He wouldn't want this, you know," Charles said softly. "Papa always said you were strongest when you took care of yourself first. He used to worry about you working too hard, not eating enough during state visits." A small smile tugged at the corners of Elizabeth's mouth. "He did, didn't he? He would sneak extra sandwiches into my briefcase when he thought I wasn't looking. Said I needed to keep my strength up for the people who depended on me." "He was right," Charles replied. "The country needs you now more than ever. But, more importantly, we need you, your family needs you." Elizabeth's composure began to crack slightly. Her lower lip trembled as she fought back tears. "I don't know how to do this without him, Charles. For 73 years, he was there. Through every crisis, every celebration, every difficult decision. He was my constant companion, my greatest supporter. How do I face each day knowing I'll never hear his voice again?" Charles felt his own eyes fill with tears as he watched his mother's pain. Throughout his life, he had seen her face countless challenges with unwavering strength. She had weathered political storms, family scandals, and personal tragedies with grace. But this was different. This was a wound that struck at the very core of who she was. "You take it one day at a time," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "One moment at a time if you have to. And you remember that you're not alone. We're all here for you, Camilla, William, Harry, the grandchildren. We're all grieving too, but we're grieving together." Elizabeth squeezed his hand tightly. "I keep expecting him to walk through that door. This morning I woke up and, for just a moment, I forgot. I reached over to his side of the bed, thinking I could tell him about a strange dream I'd had. The realization hit me like a physical blow." The Queen's voice broke as she continued. "We had our routines, you know. Every morning he would bring me tea and the newspapers. He'd read me the most ridiculous headlines and make such funny comments. He had this way of finding humor in everything, even the most serious situations. The palace feels so quiet now, so empty. Charles moved closer, putting his arm around his mother's shoulders. It was a gesture that would have seemed shocking to anyone outside the family, but, in this moment, titles and formalities meant nothing. He was simply a son comforting his grieving mother. "Tell me about one of your favorite memories with him," Charles said gently. "Something that always makes you smile." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant as she searched through decades of shared experiences. Finally, a genuine smile crossed her face. "It was during our silver wedding anniversary celebrations," she began. "There was a formal dinner at Buckingham Palace, and Philip was supposed to give a speech. But he had been having trouble with his speech all week, kept forgetting his lines, which was so unlike him. I was terrified he would embarrass himself in front of all our guests." She paused, the memory bringing warmth to her voice. "When the time came, he stood up and began speaking beautifully about our marriage, about duty and service. Then, halfway through, he just stopped and looked directly at me. He said, 'You know what? This is all rubbish. What I really want to say is that Elizabeth makes the best scrambled eggs in England, and, after 25 years, she still laughs at my terrible jokes. That's what real love is.'" Charles chuckled softly. "I remember that." The entire dining room erupted in laughter. It was so perfectly Papa, turning a formal occasion into something genuine and heartfelt. "The press had a field day with it," Elizabeth continued. "But I loved him even more for it. He never cared about what was proper or expected. He just spoke from the heart. And, you know what? He was right about the scrambled eggs." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own memories of Philip. The sun had moved across the sky, casting new patterns of light through the tall windows. Elizabeth felt something she hadn't experienced in days, a small sense of peace. "He loved you so much, Mother," Charles said eventually. "He told me once that marrying you was the best decision he ever made, even if it meant giving up his naval career. He said you gave him purpose beyond anything he could have imagined." Elizabeth's eyes filled with fresh tears, but they were softer now, less painful. "He gave me strength I never knew I had. When I became queen so young, I was terrified. The responsibility felt overwhelming. But Philip was there every step of the way, supporting me, challenging me when I needed it, making me laugh when the weight of the crown felt too heavy. He saw you as more than just the queen," Charles observed. "To him, you were always just Elizabeth, his wife, the mother of his children, his partner in everything." "Yes," she whispered. "And I was. For all the public duties and royal obligations, in our private moments, I was just a woman who loved her husband deeply. He made sure I never forgot that part of myself." Charles stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens below. He could see the rose garden where his parents had often walked together in the evenings, hand in hand despite their advanced age. Their love story had been one of the great romances of the 20th century, even though it had played out largely in public view. "I've been thinking about his legacy," Charles said, turning back to his mother. "Not just the Duke of Edinburgh Award or his environmental work, though those were important. I think his greatest legacy was the way he loved you, the way he supported the monarchy while still being his own person." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "He modernized so many aspects of royal life without losing respect for tradition. He understood that the monarchy needed to evolve to remain relevant, but he also knew what was worth preserving. He had such wisdom about people, about life. The children adored him," Charles added, thinking of his sons and their cousins. "William was just telling me yesterday about the sailing lessons Grandpapa gave him at Balmoral. He said Papa taught him more about courage and determination in those few weeks than he learned anywhere else. He had infinite patience with the grandchildren," Elizabeth smiled. "Much more than he had with you children when you were young. I used to tease him that he was getting soft in his old age." "Not soft," Charles corrected gently. "Just more secure in showing his love. He knew he didn't have unlimited time left." The mention of time brought a shadow back to Elizabeth's face. "I keep thinking about all the things we'll never do together now. We had planned to visit the Scottish Highlands again this summer. He wanted to see the red deer one more time.
Now I'll have to make that journey alone.
You don't have to do anything alone, Charles reminded her firmly. We may not be able to replace Papa, but we can be there with you. We can share in the memories and create new ones to honor him. Elizabeth looked at her son with fresh appreciation. She had sometimes worried that Charles was too sensitive, too emotional for the rigors of kingship. But today she saw something different in him, a strength that came from vulnerability, a leadership born of compassion. Philip would have been proud. When did you become so wise? She asked with a small smile. I learned from the best, Charles replied. Both of you taught me that true strength isn't about hiding your emotions, it's about feeling them deeply and still finding the courage to carry on. As the afternoon light began to fade, Elizabeth felt something shift inside her. The crushing weight of grief was still there, would always be there in some form. But, alongside it now was something else, gratitude for the incredible life she had shared with Philip, and love for the family they had built together. Perhaps I could manage some soup for dinner, she said quietly. And, maybe you could tell me more about your conversation with William. I want to hear everything, how the children are coping, how Catherine is managing everything. Charles's face lit up with relief and joy. It was the first time since the funeral that his mother had shown interest in anything beyond her own grief. I'd love to. And, maybe afterwards, we could look through some of the photo albums? I brought the ones from our last Christmas at Sandringham. I'd like that very much, Elizabeth said, meaning it. Philip always said that memories are only painful if we let them die with the person we've lost. He wanted his memory to bring joy, not just sorrow. As they prepared to leave the sitting room together, Elizabeth paused at the door and looked back. For just a moment, she could almost see Philip sitting in his favorite chair, newspaper in hand, looking up at her with that familiar twinkle in his eye. Instead of pain, the image brought her a sense of comfort. He would always be with her, in every room they had shared, in every tradition they had built together, in every laugh they had enjoyed. Come along then, she said to Charles, her voice stronger than it had been in days. Let's go have that soup. And, Charles? Yes, Mother? Thank you. For today, for everything. Your father would be proud of the man you've become. As they walked down the corridor together, the Queen's step was steadier, her shoulders straighter. The grief remained, but she was beginning to remember who she was beyond it, a mother, a grandmother, a sovereign, and, most importantly, a woman who had been blessed with a love that would transcend death itself. The following morning brought with it a gentle spring rain that pattered softly against the windows of Windsor Castle. Queen Elizabeth woke earlier than she had in days, though sleep had come fitfully. Dreams of Philip had filled her night, not the sad dreams of recent weeks, but warm memories that felt like visits from beyond. She had dreamed of their honeymoon at Broadlands, of dancing together at state functions, of quiet Sunday mornings reading the papers in bed. For the first time since the funeral, she felt strong enough to venture beyond her private quarters. The hallways of Windsor seemed different now, not empty as they had before, but filled with echoes of shared history. Every painting, every piece of furniture, every artifact told a story of their life together. Elizabeth found herself drawn to the library, a room where she and Philip had spent countless hours. He had been an voracious reader, always eager to discuss the latest biography or historical account. The leather-bound volumes still carried the faint scent of his cologne, and she noticed several books left open on his reading table, as if he had simply stepped away for tea and would return at any moment. Charles discovered her there an hour later, sitting in Philip's favorite armchair with a book of naval history open in her lap. He had been worried when the staff mentioned she had left her room so early, but seeing her surrounded by familiar things seemed like progress. "Good morning, Mother," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "How are you feeling today?" Elizabeth looked up from the book, her eyes clearer than they had been since the funeral. "Different," she replied thoughtfully. "Still sad, but I don't know how to explain it. It's as if he's here with me in this room." Charles noticed the book she was reading, a detailed account of the naval battles of World War II. "Papa's favorite subject," he observed, settling into a nearby chair. "He was so proud of his naval service," Elizabeth said, running her fingers across the pages. "He would read these accounts and tell me stories about his own experiences. He had such vivid memories of his time on the HMS Valiant and, later on the HMS Whelp. He said those years shaped him more than anything else in his life. I remember him telling us about the night he was on watch when the Japanese surrendered, Charles said. He was there in Tokyo Bay when the surrender ceremony took place on the USS Missouri. He always said it was one of the most significant moments in history he was privileged to witness. He had such respect for his fellow servicemen, Elizabeth continued. Even in his later years, he would attend veterans' events whenever his health permitted. He said he owed them too much to let them be forgotten. She paused, a sad smile crossing her face. I suppose now he's joined them in a different way. Charles watched his mother carefully. There was still profound sadness in her expression, but something else was emerging, a desire to honor Philip's memory rather than simply mourn his absence. It was exactly what Philip would have wanted to see. The staff mentioned that several hundred letters have arrived, Charles said gently. Messages of condolence from around the world. Perhaps later, if you feel up to it, we could look through some of them together? Elizabeth nodded slowly. I'd like that. Philip always insisted that we read the letters from the public personally. He said they deserved to know that their words reached us, not just a secretary. She closed the naval history book and held it close to her chest. He had such faith in people's goodness. Even when the press was difficult or there were controversies, he believed that most people genuinely cared about doing the right thing. He saw the best in everyone, Charles agreed. Even when dealing with difficult politicians or challenging diplomatic situations, he somehow found a way to connect with people on a human level. That's a rare gift. Elizabeth stood and walked to one of the tall windows, gazing out at the rain-soaked gardens. I've been thinking about what happens next, she said quietly. I know I need to return to my duties, to my responsibilities as queen. But I'm not sure how to do that without him beside me. For so many years, he was my partner in everything. State dinners, foreign tours, ceremonial occasions, he made all of it feel manageable, even enjoyable. Charles joined her at the window. You don't have to figure it all out at once, he said. Perhaps we could start small. Maybe a brief appearance at the weekly audience with the Prime Minister? Just to ease back into the routine? The Prime Minister, Elizabeth mused. Philip always had such interesting perspectives on politics. He never interfered, of course, but, in private he would share his observations about the various leaders we met. He had such insight into character, into what motivated people. I'll miss his counsel more than I can express. His political instincts were remarkable, Charles acknowledged. I remember him predicting the outcome of elections years before they happened, just based on his reading of public sentiment and the personalities involved. Elizabeth turned back to the room, her gaze falling on a collection of photographs displayed on a side table. Images of state visits, family gatherings, and private moments filled elegant silver frames. She walked over and picked up a picture from their trip to Australia in the 1960s, showing her and Philip laughing together at some forgotten joke. We traveled so much together, she said, studying the photograph. Every continent, dozens of countries. He made even the most formal state visits feel like adventures. Do you remember when we got caught in that sudden rainstorm in Jamaica? The local officials were mortified, but Philip just started laughing and dancing in the rain. Soon everyone was laughing. I remember hearing about that, Charles smiled. The photos appeared in newspapers worldwide, the Queen and Prince Philip thoroughly soaked but looking absolutely delighted. Papa always said it was one of his favorite royal moments because it showed that you were both real people beneath the titles. He hated pretense of any kind, Elizabeth recalled. He would always find ways to break tension or awkwardness with humor or unexpected gestures. At formal dinners, he would sometimes ask the most unusual questions, not to be rude, but out of genuine curiosity about people's lives and work. Charles remembered countless stories about his father's ability to put people at ease. The veterans always loved him because he would ask specific questions about their service, their families, their post-war careers. He made everyone feel like their story mattered. Elizabeth set down the photograph and picked up another, this one showing Philip teaching a young William to ride a horse at Balmoral.
Philip's patience and gentle guidance were evident even in the still image.
"He was such a wonderful grandfather," she said softly.
"With our children, he was sometimes stern, always proper about duty and responsibility. But, with the grandchildren, he seemed to relax into pure joy.
He would spend hours teaching them things: sailing, writing, fishing, photography.
He said grandchildren gave him permission to be playful again."
"William treasures those writing lessons," Charles said. "He told me that Grandpapa taught him that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing what needs to be done even when you are afraid. That lesson has served him well in his royal duties." "And, Harry," Elizabeth continued, "Philip saw something special in that boy from the beginning. He understood Harry's need for adventure, his sometimes rebellious spirit. Instead of trying to suppress it, Philip channeled it into positive directions. He was the one who suggested Harry consider military service."
"Papa's influence on all the grandchildren was profound," Charles observed.
"They learned from him that being royal doesn't mean being perfect, it means being authentic while serving something greater than yourself." Elizabeth moved to another section of photographs, these showing more recent family gatherings. Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations, quiet moments at Sandringham and Balmoral. In every image, Philip was clearly the family patriarch, surrounded by children and grandchildren who adored him.
"The family dynamics will be so different now," she said with concern.
"Philip was our anchor, the one who kept everyone grounded. Family gatherings revolved around his stories, his gentle teasing, his ability to make even the most disparate personalities feel connected to each other. We'll find new ways to honor that," Charles assured her. "The love he built into this family doesn't disappear with his passing. If anything, our shared grief right now is bringing us closer together. Look at how William and Harry have been supporting each other, putting aside their differences to focus on what really matters."
Elizabeth nodded, encouraged by this observation.
"You're right. Yesterday, Anne called to check on me, and she spent 20 minutes telling me about a conversation she'd had with Edward about Papa's environmental work.
They're planning some kind of initiative to continue his conservation efforts. It made me proud to see them working together like that."
"The Duke of Edinburgh Award will continue," Charles added.
"Millions of young people have benefited from that program, and it will be his lasting legacy."
"Every time a young person challenges themselves, pushes beyond their comfort zone, learns new skills, they're honoring his vision." Elizabeth felt a warmth spread through her chest as she considered the ongoing impact of Philip's work. He always said that the award wasn't about creating perfect young people, it was about helping them discover their own potential. He believed every person had something unique to contribute to the world. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that made him such an effective consort," Charles reflected.
"He never tried to overshadow you or compete for attention.
Instead, he found ways to complement and enhance the work of the monarchy. He created his own meaningful role while always supporting yours." The rain outside had intensified, creating a cozy atmosphere in the library. Elizabeth found herself feeling more peaceful than she had since Philip's death. Being surrounded by his books, his photographs, his presence that seemed to linger in every corner of the room, was comforting rather than painful. "I want to do something to honor his memory," she said suddenly. "Something beyond the official memorials and tributes. Something personal but meaningful to the wider world." Charles leaned forward with interest.
"What are you thinking?"
Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, considering. "Philip always believed in practical action rather than grand gestures. Perhaps we could establish a scholarship program for young people interested in environmental science or sustainable technology. Something that would continue his work in conservation while helping the next generation develop solutions to the challenges we're facing." "That's a beautiful idea," Charles said, his voice filled with enthusiasm.
"It combines his passion for the environment with his belief in young people's potential.
And it would be something tangible that could grow and evolve over time. We could work with universities and research institutions," Elizabeth continued, her voice growing stronger as the idea developed. "Not just in Britain, but throughout the Commonwealth.
Philip always said that environmental challenges require global cooperation."
Charles could see his mother's spirits lifting as she focused on this positive project.
"Would you like me to reach out to some contacts?" I know several university chancellors and environmental organizations that would be eager to participate in something like this.
Yes, Elizabeth said with the first genuine smile Charles had seen from her in weeks.
But let's plan it properly.
Philip would want it done right, with real impact rather than just good intentions. We should research what already exists, identify the gaps that need filling, ensure we're not duplicating efforts but rather enhancing them.
That sounds exactly like Papa's approach, Charles agreed.
Thorough research, practical planning, measurable results.
He would be proud of this initiative.
Elizabeth walked back to Philip's reading chair and sat down, but this time she looked comfortable rather than lost. I can almost hear him now, asking pointed questions about the selection criteria, the funding structure, the long-term sustainability of the program.
He never let good intentions substitute for good planning.
He was remarkably practical for someone who could have lived entirely on ceremony and tradition, Charles observed. I think that's what made his environmental work so effective. He approached it like an engineering problem to be solved rather than just a cause to support.
Exactly, Elizabeth agreed.
And that's how we'll approach this scholarship program. We'll make sure it actually helps young people and advances real environmental progress.
It will be a fitting tribute to his memory.
As the afternoon wore on, mother and son continued to plan their memorial project, their conversation gradually expanding to include memories of Philip's environmental passion, his relationships with young people, and his hope for the future. The library, which had felt like a shrine to loss that morning, slowly transformed into a workshop for honoring a life well lived. By evening, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't experienced since Philip's death, hope for the future mixed with gratitude for the past. The grief remained, would always remain, but it was no longer the only emotion in her heart. Love, purpose, and determination had rejoined the mix, creating a foundation for moving forward while never forgetting what she had lost. 3 days later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the Queen's private study as she and Charles prepared to tackle the enormous pile of condolence letters that had arrived from around the world. The Postal Service had delivered them in large canvas bags, hundreds upon hundreds of messages from heads of state, fellow monarchs, military veterans, schoolchildren, and ordinary people whose lives had somehow been touched by Prince Philip's long service. Elizabeth had dressed more formally today, choosing a navy blue dress with a simple pearl necklace armor for facing the world's grief while processing her own. She felt stronger than she had since the funeral, though the task ahead seemed daunting. Philip had always insisted they read personal letters from the public themselves, believing that people deserved to know their words had reached the intended recipient. Perhaps we should start with the official correspondence, Charles suggested, gesturing toward a smaller stack of letters from world leaders and diplomatic missions.
Those might be easier to manage emotionally.
Elizabeth shook her head gently. No, let's begin with the ones from ordinary people. Philip always said those were the most important. He believed that real understanding came from listening to individual stories, not formal statements from institutions. Charles nodded and opened the first letter, from an elderly man in Yorkshire whose handwriting trembled with age.
He began to read aloud, "Your Majesty, I served under Prince Philip's command on HMS Magpie in 1950.
He was the finest officer I ever knew, demanding but fair, serious about his duties but never too proud to share a joke with the crew. He treated every sailor with respect, regardless of rank." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of pride rather than pure sorrow. He talked about his time commanding Magpie often. He said it was one of the happiest periods of his life because he was doing work that felt directly meaningful. The crew became like family to him. Charles continued reading the letter, which went on to describe specific incidents where Philip had shown concern for his sailors' welfare, had advocated for better conditions, and had earned their loyalty through genuine leadership rather than mere authority. The man concluded by saying that Philip's example had shaped how he later treated his own subordinates throughout a career in engineering. "Look at that," Elizabeth said softly. Philip's influence rippling out through decades, affecting people he probably never knew he had touched. That sailor became a leader himself because of what he learned from your father. The next letter was from a young woman in Canada whose grandfather had met Philip during a Commonwealth tour in the 1970s. She wrote about how her grandfather, a war veteran struggling with what would now be recognized as PTSD, had been invited to a small reception for local ex-servicemen. Philip had spent 20 minutes talking with him about his experiences, listening without judgment and sharing some of his own memories of the war. My grandfather came home that night transformed, the letter continued. For the first time since coming back from overseas, he felt like someone understood what he had been through. Prince Philip's kindness gave him permission to seek help, to talk about his experiences with our family. It literally saved his life, and, by extension, it saved our family too.
Charles looked up from the letter with amazement.
Papa never mentioned that conversation, but it clearly meant everything to this man and his family.
How many lives did he touch like this without ever knowing the full impact?
Elizabeth wiped her eyes carefully. He had such intuition about when people were struggling. He could sense pain in others, perhaps because he carried his own from the war, from his difficult childhood. He knew what it meant to feel isolated or misunderstood. The letters continued, each one revealing a different facet of Philip's character and impact. A teacher wrote about the time he had visited her school for an award ceremony and had noticed a shy student standing apart from the others. He had drawn the child into conversation, discovering a passion for marine biology, and had spent several minutes describing his own interest in conservation.
That brief encounter had inspired the student to pursue a career in environmental science.
He saw potential where others saw problems, Elizabeth reflected. That shy child probably felt invisible to most adults, but Philip recognized something special and took the time to nurture it. A letter from Australia told the story of a remote Aboriginal community that Philip had visited during a tour in the 1960s. The writer, now an elder himself, described how Philip had shown genuine interest in their traditional stories and customs, asking thoughtful questions and listening respectfully to their answers. In an era when such respectful engagement was rare, his approach had made a lasting impression on the entire community. He was ahead of his time in so many ways, Charles observed. His genuine curiosity about different cultures, his respect for indigenous knowledge, these attitudes that seem obvious now were quite progressive for someone of his generation and background. Elizabeth picked up the next letter herself, this one from a family in Wales. Their teenage daughter had participated in the Duke of Edinburgh Award program and had initially complained about having to complete community service. During her volunteering at a local care home, she had met an elderly resident who had known Philip during his naval service. The man's stories about Philip's leadership and character had inspired the girl to pursue a career in social work. The award program created so many unexpected connections, Elizabeth mused. Philip designed it to challenge young people, but he probably never imagined it would also serve as a bridge between generations, connecting today's youth with the experiences of their elders.
As they continued reading, patterns began to emerge.
Story after story described Philip's ability to make people feel valued and heard.
Veterans wrote about his genuine understanding of military service.
Young people described how he had encouraged their ambitions.
Environmental advocates shared memories of his passionate commitment to conservation. Scientists recalled his intelligent questions and practical suggestions for their research.
Charles opened a letter that made him pause. It was from a young prince in a small European monarchy, describing how Philip had mentored him during his early years as a working royal. The letter spoke of Philip's advice about balancing personal desires with public duty, about maintaining authenticity while fulfilling ceremonial obligations. He was a mentor to so many people in similar positions, Charles said. Other royal consorts, military leaders, anyone trying to create meaningful roles in formal institutions. He understood better than anyone how to serve without overshadowing, how to support while maintaining your own identity.
Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. He created the template for what a modern royal consort could be.
Before him, there weren't many models for how to be married to a reigning queen while still maintaining dignity and purpose. He had to invent that role himself. The afternoon brought letters from children, many accompanied by drawings of Prince Philip in his military uniform or formal royal attire. Their messages were simple but heartfelt. Thank you for serving our queen.
You were a good grandfather to everyone. I'm sorry you're sad about Prince Philip. These innocent expressions of sympathy touched Elizabeth deeply.
Children have such pure hearts, she said, studying a crayon drawing of herself and Philip holding hands. They understand loss without needing complicated explanations.
They simply offer comfort because they know it's needed. One letter from a 10-year-old girl in Scotland included a pressed flower from her garden. "My gran says flowers help when you're sad because they remind you that beautiful things can grow again," she had written in careful script. "I hope this flower helps you remember happy things about Prince Philip." Elizabeth held the pressed flower carefully, thinking about the child's simple wisdom. She's right, isn't she? Beauty does grow again, even after loss. Philip would have loved this child's insight. As evening approached, they had made their way through dozens of letters, each one adding another layer to the complex portrait of Philip's impact on the world. The formal condolences from heads of state seemed almost secondary to these personal testimonies from individuals whose lives had been changed by brief encounters with the Duke of Edinburgh. Charles noticed his mother's improved demeanor as they worked through the correspondence. The act of reading about Philip's positive influence seemed to be healing in itself, transforming grief into a deeper appreciation for a life well lived. "There's something I want to share with you," Elizabeth said as they prepared to close their reading session for the day. "Something Philip told me not long before he died." Charles set down the letters he was organizing and gave his mother his full attention. He said he hoped that when people remembered him, they wouldn't focus on his titles or ceremonies, but on the small moments when he was able to help someone feel valued or capable of more than they thought possible. He said those brief connections were what gave his life real meaning. "These letters suggest he achieved exactly what he hoped for," Charles replied. "Every story we've read today is about those small moments: a conversation with a veteran, an encouraging word to a young person, a genuine interest in someone's work or culture." Elizabeth stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where she and Philip had taken so many evening walks. "I think I'm beginning to understand how to honor his memory properly. It's not just about grand memorials or official tributes. It's about continuing to see people the way he did, as individuals with stories worth hearing and potential worth nurturing." "That's exactly right," Charles agreed. "The scholarship program we discussed is a perfect example. It honors his memory by creating opportunities for young people to develop their potential, just as he did through the award program and countless personal encounters." Elizabeth turned back to her son with renewed determination. "Tomorrow, I'd like to personally respond to some of these letters. Not formal acknowledgments, but real responses to their stories." Philip always believed that communication should be genuine, not just polite. "The private secretaries will probably be horrified by the additional workload," Charles warned with a smile. "But I think Papa would be delighted that you want to continue his tradition of treating correspondence as real conversation rather than mere duty." As they prepared to leave the study, Elizabeth felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since Philip's death. The letters had shown her that grief didn't have to be the end of the story. It could be the beginning of a deeper commitment to the values and approaches that had made Philip's life meaningful. "Charles," she said as they reached the door, "thank you for insisting we do this together. Reading these letters alone would have been overwhelming. But sharing them with you, seeing Philip's legacy through these many different perspectives, it's helped me remember that love doesn't end with death. It continues in all the lives that were touched and changed." "That's exactly what Papa would want us to understand," Charles replied. "His greatest gift wasn't his service to the monarchy or even his individual achievements. It was his ability to help others become better versions of themselves. And that gift keeps giving, through every person he influenced, every life he touched, every moment of kindness he inspired in others." As they walked down the corridor together, Elizabeth felt Philip's presence not as an absence to be mourned, but as a living legacy to be continued. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, new chances to see people the way Philip had seen them, as individuals worthy of respect, attention, and encouragement. In that continuing mission, his spirit would live on, and her own purpose would find new expression. 2 weeks after their afternoon reading condolence letters, Queen Elizabeth stood in the blue drawing room at Windsor Castle, preparing for her first formal engagement since Prince Philip's funeral. It was to be a private audience with the Prime Minister, a gentle return to her constitutional duties that Charles had carefully arranged. She wore one of Philip's favorite colors, a soft lavender that he had always said brought out the blue in her eyes. The morning had begun with a ritual that was becoming precious to her: tea in Philip's chair in the library, reading aloud from the newspaper as he had done for so many years.
She found that hearing her own voice filling the silence helped her feel connected to him while also preparing her mind for the day's responsibilities. Charles arrived early to check on her readiness, both practical and emotional. He found her standing before the portrait of Philip that hung prominently in the drawing room, painted during his naval years when his face still held the eager confidence of youth. "How are you feeling about today?" he asked gently, joining her in contemplation of the portrait.
"Nervous," Elizabeth admitted. "Not about the meeting itself. I've had weekly audiences with prime ministers for 70 years.
But this will be the first time since I've had to face the world as just myself, without him beside me for strength." "You're not just yourself," Charles reminded her. "You're carrying forward everything he taught you, everything you built together. He's part of who you are now, not separate from you." Elizabeth turned from the portrait to face her son.
"You sound like him, you know."
Philip always had a way of reframing challenges to help me see them differently. He would say something similar, that I wasn't losing his support, but rather incorporating it more deeply into who I am.
Perhaps that's one of the gifts of deep partnership, Charles reflected.
After so many years together, you don't lose the person, you discover that they become part of your own wisdom, your own strength. The Prime Minister arrived precisely on time, as protocol demanded. Elizabeth received him in her customary manner, but Charles noticed subtle changes in her approach. Where she had once deferred to Philip's pre-meeting briefings about current political dynamics, she now drew on her own decades of experience and observation. Her questions were more direct, her comments more personal. Without Philip's familiar presence to lean on, she was discovering her own voice more fully. After the audience concluded successfully, Elizabeth felt a quiet satisfaction. The constitutional machinery of government had continued to function smoothly, as it had for centuries. Her role in that process remained vital and valued. But, more than that, she had proven to herself that she could fulfill her duties while honoring Philip's memory rather than being overwhelmed by his absence.
That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor.
Princess Anne arrived unannounced, something she rarely did, carrying a leather portfolio that Elizabeth recognized as belonging to Philip. Her daughter's expression was serious but not sad, determined rather than grieving. "I've been going through Papa's papers," and began without preamble, a directness she had inherited from her father. His correspondence, his notes about various projects, his ideas for future initiatives. "I thought you should see some of these before we decide how to handle his estate." Elizabeth settled into a comfortable chair, curious about what Anne had discovered. Her daughter had always been closest to Philip in temperament, practical, straightforward, impatient with ceremony but deeply committed to service. He was working on something he called the Next Generation Protocol, and continued, opening the portfolio.
Detailed plans for how the monarchy should evolve over the next 25 years.
He'd been thinking about everything from environmental initiatives to youth engagement to modernizing ceremonial traditions. Elizabeth felt a mix of surprise and profound emotion.
"He never mentioned this to me. When was he working on it?"
Based on the dates on the documents, he'd been developing these ideas for the past 3 years, and replied.
"I think he wanted to present you with a complete vision rather than incomplete thoughts."
You know how he was about thorough preparation. As Anne shared Philip's notes and recommendations, Elizabeth was struck by the depth of his thinking about the monarchy's future. He had anticipated challenges that hadn't yet emerged and proposed solutions that seemed remarkably foresight. His environmental initiatives were more ambitious than anything they had discussed publicly. His ideas for youth engagement went far beyond the Duke of Edinburgh award program.
He was still planning for decades ahead, Elizabeth marveled. Still thinking about problems he might not live to see solved.
That's so like him, looking beyond his own immediate concerns to consider what would benefit future generations. And showed her father's detailed analysis of public sentiment, changing social attitudes, and emerging global challenges. His recommendations were practical and specific, addressing everything from the carbon footprint of royal households to new ways of engaging with Commonwealth nations to strategies for maintaining relevance in an increasingly digital world. "This is remarkable," Elizabeth said, studying pages of Philip's careful handwriting interspersed with typed reports and statistical analyses.
He was essentially designing a blueprint for the monarchy's continued evolution.
And he was doing it with such optimism about our ability to adapt and remain meaningful. There's more, and said, turning to a section marked Personal Recommendations. He wrote individual assessments of each family member's strengths and potential contributions. He had very specific ideas about how everyone from William and Catherine to the youngest grandchildren could serve the institution while developing their own authentic roles. Elizabeth's hands trembled slightly as she read Philip's assessment of her own future role. He had written with clear-eyed realism about the challenges of advancing age while expressing complete confidence in her continued ability to serve effectively. His suggestions for gradually sharing responsibilities with Charles and other family members were thoughtful and practical. He saw this transition period coming, she realized. Not just his own death, but the broader generational shift that will define the monarchy's next era. He was trying to help all of us prepare for changes that felt too difficult to contemplate. The most touching section contained Philip's hopes for Elizabeth's own future. He had written about his desire for her to find joy and purpose beyond their partnership, to discover aspects of herself that had perhaps been overshadowed by their shared roles. He encouraged her to pursue interests that had always intrigued her but that she had never had time to explore properly. He wanted you to have your own adventures, and observed, reading over her mother's shoulder. He wrote about your love of horses, your interest in photography, your curiosity about archaeology. He thought you should have opportunities to pursue these passions without feeling guilty about taking time from official duties. Elizabeth felt tears threatening as she read Philip's words about their marriage and partnership. He had written with such gratitude for their life together while expressing excitement about what she might accomplish in the years ahead. There was no sense of self-pity or regret, only love and hope for her continued happiness. He was giving me permission to have a life after him, she whispered. Even in his private thoughts, he was still taking care of me, still worried about my well-being. Charles arrived as they were reviewing Philip's environmental initiatives. His father had outlined an ambitious program for making all royal properties carbon neutral within 10 years, creating wildlife corridors between royal estates, and establishing the monarchy as a global leader in sustainable practices. This is exactly the kind of forward-thinking Papa was known for, Charles said, studying the detailed implementation plans. He wasn't just identifying problems, he was designing practical solutions and calculating the resources needed to achieve specific goals. Elizabeth saw an opportunity to begin implementing Philip's vision immediately. Could we announce the environmental initiative as part of my birthday celebrations this year? Instead of focusing on personal milestones, we could launch this program as a tribute to his memory and a commitment to the future he envisioned. That would be perfect, Anne agreed. It honors his legacy while demonstrating that the monarchy continues to evolve and lead on important issues. And it gives us something positive and purposeful to focus on during what could otherwise be a melancholy period. As they continued reviewing Philip's papers, Elizabeth felt a profound shift in her understanding of grief and moving forward. She had been thinking about honoring his memory primarily in terms of preserving what they had built together. But his own plan showed that he had been expecting and hoping for continued evolution, new initiatives, bold steps into uncharted territory. He wasn't asking us to maintain a museum of his achievements, she realized aloud. He was challenging us to build on what he started, to take risks he didn't have time to take himself, to imagine possibilities he could only begin to explore. The evening brought the family together for a private dinner, the first such gathering since the funeral. William and Catherine had driven down from London with their children. Harry had joined them by video call from California. Edward and Sophie arrived with their teenagers. The conversation naturally centered on Philip's plans and everyone's thoughts about implementing his vision. Elizabeth watched her family discussing their grandfather's and father's ideas with enthusiasm and creativity. The grandchildren, in particular, seemed energized by the environmental initiatives and had suggestions for engaging their own generation in conservation efforts. For the first time since Philip's death, the family gathering felt focused on the future rather than anchored in loss. "Grandpapa would love this," William observed as the children excitedly discussed plans for wildlife gardens at their schools. He always said the best way to honor the past was to create an even better future. As the evening concluded, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't expected to experience so soon after Philip's death: excitement about the work ahead. His vision was challenging and ambitious, but it was also inspiring and achievable.
More importantly, it gave her a way to channel her grief into purposeful action.
"I want to make an announcement next week," she told the family as they prepared to leave.
"About our commitment to implementing Philip's environmental program and expanding the youth initiatives he designed.
I want the world to know that his death marks the beginning of a new chapter in his legacy, not the end of his influence." Charles embraced his mother warmly. "Papa would be so proud to see you taking charge of his vision this way. You're not just continuing his work, you're making it your own." Later that night, alone in her private sitting room, Elizabeth looked through Philip's personal notes once more. On the final page, written in his distinctive handwriting, was a message clearly intended for her: "Darling, if you're reading this, it means I've gone ahead to scout the territory, as I always did on our travels. Don't hurry to follow, there's still so much important work for you to do.
Build something wonderful on the foundation we created together. Love always, Philip."
Elizabeth held the letter close to her heart, feeling Philip's love and encouragement surrounding her like a warm embrace. For the first time since his death, she looked toward the future with anticipation rather than apprehension. There would still be difficult days, moments of overwhelming sadness, times when his absence felt unbearable. But there would also be purpose, growth, discovery, and the satisfaction of bringing his dreams to life in ways he could never have imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. The monarchy would continue to evolve, the family would grow and change, and her own role would develop in directions she was only beginning to understand. But she would face it all with the wisdom Philip had shared with her, the strength their partnership had built in her, and the love that would connect them forever across whatever boundaries separated this world from the next. As she prepared for bed, Elizabeth felt truly peaceful for the first time since Philip's death. Grief would always be part of her now, but it need not define her future. Instead, it could fuel a deeper commitment to the values and vision they had shared, ensuring that their love story would continue to unfold through the work she carried forward in his honor and her own right.